Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing a lot better, thank you very much. Each day I get a bit stronger from this flu that really knocked me for six. So I'm hoping you're keeping yourself well as well, because you don't want to get exposed to those winter germs all around the place that we can become quite susceptible to. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And remember, we're on part 2 of our story, where the grandfather is telling his children about a very awkward night when there was a face staring in at the window. And on the second night, he sees the face again. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens next. So hold your horses, brace yourself. We're continuing with part 2 of our story. Me and my brother found ourselves unwillingly looking into this creature's eyes, but our very best efforts to resist its powerful hold over us were impossible to resist, for we simply could not look away. He seized our gaze, and we were drawn to look directly into his eyes, like iron filings to a magnet. It was like he sucked us right in. As incongruous and unfathomable as it may sound to you, I did not remember anything after that moment of unwillingly staring into the outlandish creature's yellow eyes. It is almost like my memory was completely wiped out and annihilated, for I went as blank and as empty as a computer screen that has lost all its data that is impossible to recover. All I know for certain is that me and my brother Martin found ourselves wandering around in a foggy daze in this old abandoned quarry, which dipped into the ground like a dried-up old riverbed, surrounded by overhanging weeping willows on every side. I remember thinking to myself, this is a vivid, very lucid dream that feels so physically real, until I realized, after I snapped out of the ambiguous foggy blur, that this was no dream at all. Me and my brother had no way of knowing how on earth we'd got here, for indeed if we'd walked here all the way to the quarry, we could not possibly have done this in a state of unconsciousness, for even if we were sleepwalking, we would likely have come into some kind of physical trouble along the way, with all the dips and nooks and crannies in the ground, not to mention the rocks bespeckling the path in all shapes and sizes. We believe the creature with the human-like face had masterfully hypnotized us in some way, for we would never have willingly crept out of the cabin in the dead of night to go exploring the quarry, which was a good 40 minutes from where we lived. Miraculously, our feet were perfectly clean, but our pyjamas were not doing so well. They were badly torn up by thorny briars. We wondered whether in a trance-like state this huge creature that had stared at us from our bedroom window had guilefully persuaded us to leave the cabin, and subsequently carried us on his powerful back to the quarry, for this would certainly explain why the soles of our feet were not remotely dirty. But why on earth would he do something like that? To serve what purpose and what end? That was the $100 question we asked ourselves. But it would almost certainly explain why I found a few stray long black hairs on my pyjamas that I knew unequivocally belonged to the humanoid creature, for they couldn't have come from any of us. I do remember at one point in my semi-conscious state feeling as if I was being jolted around like a jelly bean in a glass jar, which made me connect the dots and guess that he had carried us here. At the time it had felt like a journey in a dream. But now I wasn't so sure. Me and Martin were terrified to suddenly find ourselves in the quarry, on a bright starlit night with a magnanimous pearly moon that illuminated the quarry in the way that made everything look hauntingly ethereal. I had always been intimidated by the dark, so I was not best pleased to find myself out here in the middle of the night. It was waking up to a living nightmare for me, it surely was. My brother looked at me in a bemused sense of confoundment. He always looked to me for guidance and advice for some reason, although God only knows why. almost as if I had all the answers, which I clearly did not. "I don't understand," he stammered. "What are we doing here? And what is that horrible smell?" he said, wrinkling up his nose in disgust. "It's really, really bad. What is it?" We could smell something foul on the wind, as if something had died. It was really nasty, like nothing I've ever smelt before or since, I hasten to say. I remember feeling like I wanted to hurl up the contents of my stomach. The back of my mouth was burning, and my eyes began to seep with water, almost as if I was chopping onions. Even years later, the memory of that rank smell still gets to me at times. You don't forget a smell like that. "I don't know," I said. "I don't know. The smell is gross. I think the hairy thing that we saw at the window, I think he brought us out here. All I remember is looking directly into his eyes. I don't remember anything after that. Now we're here. How do you explain that? The only thing I can definitely ascertain is the creature somehow persuaded us to leave the cabin, using some kind of hypnotic effect on us. We must have been in some kind of trance. I think he carried us here, because my bare feet are still clean at the bottom," I said, inspecting the soles of my feet to affirm my findings. I was to discover that my brother's feet were also meticulously clean. "But how can that be?" my brother asked me incredulously. "How could he do that to us? We were in our bedroom back at the cabin. Remember, I woke you up because I was terrified because the face was at the window again. I remember that very vividly. Our brothers were all fast asleep. I know we would never willingly leave our bedroom to follow this thing outside and come all the way to the quarry like this in the middle of the night. I wouldn't do it, and neither would you. So why are we here? I don't understand any of this. If the creature brought us here, he must have had some kind of objective, surely." "I think he had magical powers," I exclaimed. "He bewitched us in some way, made us leave the cabin, without even being consciously aware of it. That's magic, it is. If anyone heard us leaving the cabin, they would likely have thought we were using the outhouse. If we had known what we were doing, we would never have followed the creature. So it had to have been done unconsciously, in a dreamy state. He had power over us for some reason, reasons that I can't understand at all." "You mean like walking in our sleep?" my brother asked me. "Possibly," I said. "Something like that. There is no other plausible explanation, is there?" "I'm scared. I'm really scared," said my brother. "I want to go home. What if that thing that brought us here is still around?" he said, looking around himself nervously. "You don't think he wants to eat us, do you? He could be watching us right now." My brother began to tremble and shake, looking around himself all the time very carefully, as if he expected to see the hairy beast that we'd seen staring at us through the window. It was as if he was expecting the thing to come charging towards us in any second, but there was no sign of the creature anywhere. It was all cloyingly silent in the abandoned quarry, as even the sounds of crickets and frogs was rather mute, which made us all the more uneasy. My father had always warned me growing up that if it's unusually quiet, there is likely a predator around. Was this thing that had brought us here clandestinely in the middle of the night, watching us, while taking cover behind the dark shadows of some of the gnarled-looking willow trees? We could not be sure. For some incongruous, inexplicable reason, we both appeared to be on our own in the quarry, as if we'd been offloaded here like a couple of sacks of cement for a building project. The quarry was quite expansive, furnished with stones of all shapes and sizes, lots of loose sand. It was more than a little intimidating being in a space like this at night. I felt rather spooked, I have to say, my heart heavy with trepidation. I had no way of consoling my brother Martin, for I was equally as disquieted and dismayed as he was. I had no comprehension of why we'd been mysteriously brought out here to the quarry at this ungodly hour of the night, but I reasoned that we had been brought here for some purpose, although what it was not yet realized. The only thing that occurred to me, as a passing abstract thought, was that if you extract sardines from a tin, you want to eat them, don't you? In the same measure, we had been extracted from our own bedroom for unorthodox reasons we could not explain, and I could only hope that this thing, whatever it was, did not intend to eat us. There is no doubt in my mind that I had seen it staring at us from the bedroom window in our cabin. It was hard to believe that we had been lured out here, while my other brothers remained blissfully fast asleep, unaware of our unfortunate plight. It was hard to fathom that we had not succeeded in waking them up, for if we had done so, they would more than likely shaken us out of our hypnotized state. We knew one thing with crystal clear clarity. We needed to get a hell away from this abandoned quarry, as quickly as possible, to make our way back to the cabin, under the cover of darkness, hiding among the shadows along our way home, to make ourselves as inconspicuous as possible. We wondered what had become of the strange idiosyncratic creature with the human-looking face that had lured us out here. Was he pottering around in the background, waiting to pounce at an opportune moment? We could not be sure. Maybe he was like our tabby cat at home, I thought, who liked playing and toying with his live food before he actually ate it up. Or maybe bringing us out here in the middle of the night was like a fun game to him. Perhaps he wanted us to play hide and seek together, and then he'd find us. I knew it was a 40-minute walk on foot to get back to the cabin, but thankfully we did know where we were, which was an advantage, as over the last year we'd played at the quarry over a handful of times with our brothers, in secret against our parents' advice. My father did not like us playing at the quarry. He believed it was dangerous, as the ground, he reckoned, was somewhat unstable. We had ridden over here often enough on our bikes, so we knew the area alarmingly well, but we'd never navigated it in the middle of the night like this. By all accounts, it would be easy to get terribly lost, as Appalachia is full of green, hilly valleys, winding roads and ubiquitous trees everywhere. So if you didn't know where you were going, you could find yourself in lots of trouble. We knew if we wanted to take a shortcut, we'd be forced to walk through the woods, which was very creepy and menacing at this time of the night, although the trees would likely cloak our presence and give us cover. Irrespective of this fact, it was a reasonably bright starlit night. The tall, lofty trees would likely steal the moonlight away, so that our walk home would be even more hazardous. We'd be fumbling around gawkily in the darkness, carelessly tripping over tree trunks and branches, getting our feet tangled up in gnarled roots that jutted precariously through the ground, crashing into thorny briars with their knife-like thorns that would lightly, callously rip through the fabric of our pajamas, and in the process upset my mother, who did not like us ruining our clothes. But it was too late for that. Our pajamas were already ruined. We were rather lucky that in those days we were so used to going around bare feet, so the bottoms of our feet were as tough as old boots, that even thorns that bludgeoned through the ground, through the soles of our feet, were like slippery knives that we simply did not feel. We were both poignantly aware that in the dead of night, anything could be out there. We had no means of protecting ourselves, should we encounter the hairy creature that had brought us here, or another predatory wild animal. So we were worried that we might eventually become an easy snack, and the thought filled me with great dread. At the forefront of our mind was one dominant thought, overtaking all other considerations that trickled into our thinking. Was that creature that had lured us out of the cabin still skulking around somewhere, furtively watching us? Would he discreetly follow us when we left the quarry? We couldn't fathom why on earth he'd brought us here, unless he was toying with us for the benefits of satisfying his macabre sense of humour, as if we were figurines on a chessboard that he was throwing around at will, just for the hell of it. There was a wind blowing, blasting our cheeks, and washing us with that nasty rotting stench again, that we could not forget, because it was in our faces. It made me want to heave. We could hear this creaking sound. Me and my brother turned around to see this deceased human body, swinging like a pendulum on a branch backwards and forwards, from this powerful weeping willow tree. It was hanging over the edge of the quarry. The body was swinging. It was like the scene from a macabre horror movie. It was the scariest thing I have ever beheld, for a man had hung himself with a thick noose around his neck. He was staring at us through rounded sockets, with dead lifeless eyes, and in the soft moonlight that highlighted his body, enough for us to see him rather clearly, it was even more obscene. Me and my brother began to scream in abject terror, not only because it is terrifying seeing someone hanging from a tree with a thick rope around their neck, but also because we recognized the deceased man to be a good friend of my father's, a man by the name of Duncan Hewitt. This kindly, harmless soul had only been visiting our cabin the week before to play a game of cards with my father, and at the time he'd been in a jolly good upbeat mood. And now he was here, lifelessly swinging from a tree branch, being pushed forwards and backwards by the spirited wind. He was clearly dead, and we realized that the funky smell came from his decomposing corpse, that might have been hanging there for at least a couple of days for all we knew. All of a sudden we heard a shuffling sound, along with the cracking and popping sound of ponderous feet, walking over leaf litter towards us. I began to quickly panic. I instinctively knew that that monstrous Herculean-sized creature, with a face like a man, had come back. Sure enough, he was there, larger than life, emerging from the back of one of the trees like a dark, shadowy, ghostly spectre. I now know the creature to be a Bigfoot, but back then I had no comprehension of what he was, and to say that he was the most intimidating creature I have ever beheld is not an understatement, despite the fact that he was remarkably human. But that was no consolation, given his vast size. He was standing there looking at us both through his huge yellow eyes, that were that colour due to the eye shine he was giving off. In that moment I have never been more petrified in my entire life, as this Bigfoot was standing only yards away from us, and in his formidable, fearsome, awe-consuming presence, I felt as fragile as a little bug that could so easily be crushed under one of his powerful feet, if given the chance. I did want to scream, but nothing came out of my mouth. It was like I had a piece of coal stuck in the back of my throat. A voice inside my head told me to run, but it was as if I was anchored to the ground like a boat to its mooring place, so that any desire to escape was completely obliterated from my inability to move. Me and my brother remained frozen to the spot, incapable of being able to react to the Bigfoot. We felt like two mice waiting for the cat to devour us in her jaws, after perhaps having some fun with us first. Try as we might to turn our heads away from the Bigfoot and look away from his eyes, our attention was drawn straight into them again, with a magnetism we were unable to overcome. And there we were again, being swept up in the swirling pools of his yellow eyes, until all thoughts were drained, and all consciousness devoured and expunged, so that what happened next is not in the files of our recollection. I do recall this incredibly imposing Bigfoot was easily 10 foot tall, possibly more, with gargantuan shoulders like nothing I've ever seen before, and he was covered in long flowing dark hair that was a midnight black colour, although he had a white bib around his neck, like you get in some cats. The next thing I know is that I was no longer in the quarry, which was a monumental relief, let me tell you. I wake up in the morning in the bedroom in the cabin which I shared with 4 of my other brothers. I wake with a start, my heart thundering violently in my chest, as I look around my benign bedroom, and everything was perfectly as if it should be. I could hear my brothers breathing in their sleep. I could observe the rise and fall of their chests. Our bedroom in the cabin was barely big enough to swing a cat, so it was always kept fastidiously tidy, because there really was no space in that room at all, apart from the huge bed and a small closet that I shared with my brothers. But nothing was out of alignment that morning. Had I been dreaming, I wondered? It had all been so startlingly real. I examined my pyjamas, which were all torn up, and then my feet, to see if there were any signs that I'd been walking out of doors, because I was certain I'd been at the quarry. But if that was the case, how did I get back to my bedroom, with no memory of getting there in the first place? I discovered to my astonishment that there were long, dark, straggly hairs all over my pyjamas. There were a couple of leaves between my toes and in my hair. And, of course, my pyjamas were torn up to smithereens. So I knew I had been out there in the middle of the night. I shook my brother Martin wide awake. I needed answers. I needed him to confirm what had happened last night, that he'd been at the quarry with me. I told Martin about my strange, rather peculiar dream, that had confronted my dreamlike state, that had felt so real. We both discovered we had experienced the identical lucid dream on which both of us had found ourselves in the quarry, and had seen my father's friend dangling from a tree branch on the old willow tree at the edge of the quarry, with a noose around his neck. We could not have imagined that. My brother also had long hairs all over his pyjamas, and on the back of his pyjama top he had a long thorny briar caught up in the fabric. It was more than a little bizarre, confirming that we had indeed left our beds in the middle of the night to go to the quarry.
"It wasn't a dream," said my brother. "It wasn't. It couldn't have been. Remember, the thing hypnotized us from the bedroom window in the cabin. Then he brought us out to the quarry, and then he brought us back again. I remember looking into his eyes, and then we find ourselves back in our beds again. He wiped our memory. That is what he did."
We could not fathom why he'd lured us out of the cabin, only to bring us back. It made no sense at all. We thought it must have been some kind of a game to him. We were later to realize that he had clear motives in bringing us to the quarry, but at the time, in our callow naivety, we hadn't put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. Moments later, my mother came into the bedroom, looking flustered. We were all just waking up from our sleep, and were rather bleary-eyed.
"Which one of you went out last night to the outhouse and decided to leave the cabin door wide open when you returned? You know the rules. You need to bolt the front door from inside once you've finished your ablutions. I don't want you doing that again.
Do you understand, boys?" We all nodded, but my mother's revelations affirmed that it was likely under some kind of trance-like state we had indeed left the cabin during the night, and possibly been carried to the quarry by this massive Bigfoot, for reasons unknown, who had subsequently returned us safely back home, but we'd left the door wide open. We had no memory of returning to our beds. As we sat down at the breakfast table that morning, my mother looked quite sorrowful when she prepared us our porridge over the stove. For a moment she looked as if her thoughts were miles away from the kitchen. My father went up to her, putting a comforting arm around her, kissing her gently on the cheek. "Don't be upset, sweetheart. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. You know the saying, no news is good news, is it not?"
"Everybody's looking everywhere for the poor man,"
said my mother.
I gather over 70 people went looking for him yesterday, but he's been nowhere to be found. I'm so worried about him, that's all. His poor wife says he hasn't been in his right mind of late. He's been emotionally completely overwrought, and someone in that state needs some kind of counselling, not just barging off on long treks in the wilds like that. That's not the answer, is it? Is someone missing?
One of my brothers asked my mother curiously.
I'm afraid so, said my mother, looking at us through a lugubrious melancholia that dappled her rather stricken face with a grave despondency. You remember Duncan Hewitt, that old friend of your father's, who often goes fishing with him? Quite the fisherman he is, too. I think he was here last week, wasn't he, love, playing cards with you? Well, the poor man, he's gone missing. Over 70 people volunteered to search for him yesterday. He's disappeared off the face of the earth. Unfortunately, Helen, his devoted wife, believes he may have been attacked and killed by a wild animal. Anything's possible out there.
My mother shuddered, placing her hand on her belly in a self-soothing gesture.
The thought makes me sick to my stomach. It really does. Poor Helen. She's quite naturally fearing the worst. The woman looks like she's experienced Armageddon in her own life and lived to tell us about it. She's in such a dreadful state. By all accounts, the silly man bogged off without even bothering to take his rifle with him. I mean, who does that? If he ended up in trouble, he'd have no means of self-defense, would he? And what if he had a nasty fall and was unable to get any help? He could be anywhere. That's the problem. Where to look for him? To find him will be like looking for a needle in the haystack, I'm most sure. Helen says that Duncan is not in his right mind. He hasn't been eating at all, barely communicated a single word to her. It's like she says he's in his own little world. Unfortunately, he's been wandering off recently. Helen thought going out into nature would help him overcome his feelings of helplessness. But the trouble is he hasn't returned, has he? No one has seen sight or sound of him. I understand he's very depressed. He blames himself for his sister's unfortunate death. I think he's been blaming himself for it. Poor Helen. She's beside herself with worry, she is. Why does he blame himself for his sister's death?
My sister Kirsty asked.
I heard that his sister died in a riding accident 3 days ago or so. She was flung into a tree. She died instantly. How can that be Duncan's fault? Accidents happen all the time, don't they, Mummy? If I fall over and hurt my knee, it's not your fault, is it?
Of course it's not, sweetheart. Duncan is not to blame for his sister's death. It was a fortuitous accident. Of course you're right about that. She was flung into a tree. I doubt she knew anything at all, which is a relief, of course. It was all very quick. Your father was telling Duncan that none of this is his fault, and accidents happen, but he just wouldn't listen, would he?
I'm afraid not, said my father, wiping the crumbs from his toast that had gathered around his lips with a napkin.
You know what Duncan's like. Wears his heart on his sleeve, he does. Such a gentleman he is. He and his sister were going riding together, down the trooping trot trail. You know the one. Duncan thoroughly enjoys riding with his sister. When they were on horseback, his sister remembered she wasn't wearing a riding hat of all things. She was saying, "Can you believe it? I forgot my hat at home. Silly me." It was a once-in-a-lifetime oversight on her part. I guess it happens. She was rather nonchalant about it and said,
"Never mind, what does it matter if I'm not wearing it just for once? I mean, I can't believe I actually forgot to put it on. Usually it's the most natural thing for me to do in the world."
Duncan didn't think much of it either at the time. His sister was an excellent, very well-esteemed rider. But like anything, Sometimes when we fail to take precautions, that's when we almost tempt fate. Like the one time we don't wear a safety harness when we go climbing, or when we forget to wear our safety belt. So the very time that she wasn't wearing the protection is when she clearly needed it the most. It's ironic, but it's true. By all accounts, Duncan is now blaming himself for allowing his sister to continue riding without sufficient protection on her head. He's her older brother. Their parents died when he was young. He always took care of her from a very young age. So he was not only a brother to her, but a father figure as well, I suspect. Duncan believed if she was wearing a riding hat, she would not be dead. The tragic truth is he may be well right about that. It was her head that was seriously injured on impact during the fall. Had she been wearing a hat, she might not be dead. It's tragic, but what can you do?
It's an awful weight to have on your conscience, my mother interjected. But his sister, she chose to continue riding without her riding hat. So she's responsible for the mistake, not poor Duncan. I cannot imagine what the poor man is going through, living with all that guilt on his shoulders. He shouldn't be putting himself through all that. Mistakes tragically happen in life. We have to learn to accept that.
Don't underestimate the power of guilt, my love, my father said tentatively. It's quite literally a killer for a man. I think Duncan is blaming himself for her death. He felt he wasn't looking out for her. He's done nothing but look out for her since she was little. But he won't listen to reasonable advice when I try telling him that. His sister would not want him to be blaming himself for this accident. She would be very aggrieved if she knew what he was doing.
I don't think Helen should worry about him either, said my mother. Duncan is a sensible man, is he not? I think he might have wandered off on a lonely sabbatical or something for a few days. I'm sure he'll be back soon when he's gained some perspective and got his head together. Do you remember old Rod Willis? He did a similar thing, did he not? He sunk into a deep depression for many days after his mother died. No one saw him for 2 whole months. It turned out he'd been on an outdoor adventure, camping in the wilderness, and he came back when he got his head together, and he was so much better after that.
But there is a difference, sweetheart, said my father. Everyone in town knew that Rod Willis had gone off on an adventure, an intrepid one at that. He told everybody he needed his space. This is different. No one knows where Duncan Hewitt is at this point in time.
Well, I'm sure he'll be back soon, said my mother. Well, at least I hope so. Some men just need space, don't they, to deal with their grief. I know after my mother died, my father was so grief-stricken. He locked himself away in his study for days on end, barely acknowledging the rest of us. My older sister Clara took care of us during that time. But after a couple of weeks of grieving and locking himself away in his study, refusing to talk to anyone, my father came out from his study one day with a bright sunny smile on his face, and he said, "Anyone fancy ice cream?" We all chorused, yes, please, Daddy." I promise you he was as right as rain after that. He just needed space to come to terms with his grief. It's probably the same for Duncan.
Me and my brother, who had been solemnly listening to my parents' earnest conversation about the whereabouts of Duncan Hewitt, with heavy hearts, privately exchanged looks together. Martin nodded at me, as if encouraging me to say something about the matter.
"I'm afraid Duncan Hewitt won't be coming back," I blurted out. "Duncan Hewitt is dead."
For a moment a cloying silence descended over the kitchen table. Everything went perfectly still, as all eyes swivelled around to focus directly on me. My mother nearly choked on her toast that she was chewing. "Howard, that's a shockingly unkind thing for you to say. Where on earth did you get that preposterous idea from? Duncan is just missing, my love. I'm sure he'll be found safe and well, as I was only saying earlier. He just needs to come to terms with what happened to his sister. I gather they've put the funeral on hold until she returns. Well, until Duncan returns, that is.
I'm not lying! Why aren't you listening to me, Mum? Duncan Hewitt is at the quarry. Me and Martin saw him there hanging from a tree, a willow tree, with a rope around his neck. I think he hung himself. Maybe he's desperately sad about his sister's death. Doesn't want to live anymore, because he feels really bad about what happened to her, even though it's not his fault that she wasn't wearing a riding hat. It's true, blurted my brother. Howard isn't telling you stories, Mummy. We both saw him. We saw Duncan Hewitt last night. He was hanging from the willow tree in the quarry.
My mother flung her hands around her mouth and gasped. Her eyes widened with horror. Oh, please, no. This can't possibly be true. Please tell me you're making this up, Howard. If you are, I'm not remotely amused by this.
I'm not making it up, Mum,
I said obsequiously.
It's true.
My father's face reddened. He seemed to jiggle with indignation. There was an angry fire in his steely grey eyes that made me rather nervous. I hated seeing my father grow angry. He was an even-tempered man at the best of times, but when he got mad, he wasn't pleasant to be around. Are you boys telling me you were at the quarry last night? What the hell were you doing there? You know you kids are not allowed to frolic around in the countryside in the middle of the night. It's dangerous. What the hell were you thinking? My father was naturally aggrieved. He knew it wasn't safe going sauntering off at the dead of night, especially a good 40 minutes away from our cabin in the quarry. But he didn't have time to lay a grenade at our feet when the sobering news of what we had told him had grabbed his immediate focus, and our haunting words as to the whereabouts of his good friend had knocked him for 6. So there we are. That's the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.